I'm not using anything.
Are you not?
I'm just introducing and sitting down. Do they need the clipper? No. Okay. You tell me when.
There are seats down here for you.
Shall I go? Are we live? Are we there? Somebody going to signal to me? We're there. Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Victoria Walsh. I'm head of the Curating Contemporary Art programme here at the Royal College of Art. And on behalf of the School of Fine Art and the Royal College, I'd like to welcome you all here and those watching live online on the This Is Tomorrow website. This is the second in the season series of visual culture lectures focused on the questions and issues of contemporaneity. Titled Contemporaneity and Other Tales, the series intends to provide a critical overview of what it means to produce culture today, giving an insight into the complex fabric of artistic production. For each event in this series, the guest artist is invited to take an in-depth focus on a recent project, or to use it as a prompt, and to consider the development of a piece through the process of displays and presentations, that is to say, curating. The series was launched a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure some of you were present. A memorable talk with the artist Richard Tuttle, who obviously is also currently on show in London. Tonight's discussion brings together in conversation two iconic figures who've had an extraordinary impact not only on contemporary art but on curating. And it's a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome Joseph Kossuth and Hans Ulrich Obrist. Certainly when I was a student in the first intake of the Curating Contemporary Art course back in the early 90s, Joseph Kossuth's impact through his show, The Play, The Unmentionable, was extraordinary on us all. But to begin with a brief introduction to Joseph Kossuth, often referred to as the father of conceptual art, with works such as 1 and 3 Chairs, he's credited with initiating the strategies of appropriation, language-based works, and the use of photographies in the 1960s. Through his practice and writing, Joseph has consistently explored the production and role of language and meaning within art. His work is in most museum collections, certainly in the United States, Europe, Australia, and Asia, and he has enjoyed a notable list of solo exhibitions, many of which were noted on the publicity for this, but recently at the Musée du Louvre in Paris, also the exhibition and interpretation of this title, Nietzsche, Darwin and the Paradox of Content, at the Talbot Rice Gallery in Edinburgh, part of the Edinburgh International Festival. And then, and I realised as I tried to write this out and practice it, just what an extraordinary challenge of reading out Joseph's titles of his exhibitions are. They're not those kind of pithy ones we encourage our students to do for marketing today. But those exhibitions include, brackets, Waiting For, bracket, Text for Nothing, Samuel Beckett, In Play, Text for Nothing, Waiting For, dash, bracket, Samuel Beckett, and also along with texts, A Play of Architecture and the Mind, of Spruce Markers in London. Forthcoming exhibitions and projects include Amnesia, Various, Luminous, Fixed, Spruce Markers coming up November 2014 now, and a permanent room for a new building at the Hermitage Museum's Modern and Contemporary Art Collection, and a permanent installation at Taipei International Airport. He also currently holds the Millard Chair, an endowed professorship at Goldsmiths University. So a very warm welcome to Joseph tonight. Obviously we also have a kind of double treat for us, as Joseph will be in conversation with Hans Ulrich, who is co-director of the Serpentine Galleries, as I'm sure you will know. Before joining the Serpentine, Hans Ulrich was curator of the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville in Paris, and since his first exhibition, World Soup, The Kitchen Show, in 1991, he's curated more than 250 shows, an extraordinary record. In 2009, Hans Ulrich was made Honorary Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and in 2011, he received the CCS Bard Award for Curatorial Excellence. He has obviously lectured internationally at academic and art institutions and is contributing editor to several magazines and journals, which I think is an understatement. His recent publications include A Brief History of Curating, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Curating But Were Afraid to Ask, and Ai Weiwei, Think Like Clouds, Ai Weiwei Speaks, Ways of Curating, and new volumes of the Conversation series. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hans Ulrich, who will be in conversation with Joseph for about an hour, hour and a quarter, and then, pending how time is going, hopefully we'll be able to take some questions as well. So over to you, Hans Ulrich, and thank you to you both for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very, very much for this wonderful introduction. Of course, the invitation to do this conversation with Joseph tonight, which is wonderful because we've actually never done a longer interview. We've done a recording together with Joseph and Tino Segal, who
Tino, yeah.
Exactly. Tino always mentioned Joseph as a great influence and great inspiration, so we thought it would be interesting to do that double conversation, but tonight will be the first solo interview we do, so this is very exciting, and particularly exciting that Joseph suggested that we speak about him as a curator and as an artist curator and the exhibitions he has curated and is curating, because actually for me the exhibition in the Vienna Secession in 1989, the Wittgenstein show, was an incredibly important exhibition, and also so important because it happened actually in the space which is the longest lasting artist-run space, because the extraordinary thing is that the Secession was founded by the artist more than 100 years ago and is still an artist-run space, and was an artist-run space. It was the artist who invited Joseph to curate. It's particularly relevant also because so many exhibitions, if we look at exhibition history, which really marked history and changed the rule of the game, have actually been curated by artists. And it came to my mind this morning, conversations I had with the late Richard Hamilton, who always told me that if we really want to think about exhibition history, it's important to think not only about exhibitions which changed the rules of the game, but also about exhibitions which invented a new display feature. And he was always telling me, if we look at the 20th century, from the exhibitions which really invented new display features, a very, very big part of it were invented by artists. I mean, Hamilton, of course, referred to Marcel Duchamp and the Surrealist shows in Paris and also in New York, but there are many more. I mean, if you think about the Dada Messe, if you think about so many avant-garde exhibitions, Bruce Altschuler's book is a great evidence of that. We look at all these relevant exhibitions which are landmark shows. It's a percentage of artists run and artists invented was very big. So it's an incredible excitement to discuss this with Joseph tonight. And the idea Joseph had, which we thought is great, is that we start actually with him making a presentation. He's going to present the text about curated installations and other recent work and show us some images. And then based on that, we will discuss. And also, if there are questions from you at the end, open it to the floor. So please give again a very, very warm welcome to Joseph Kossuth.
So I'm going to give you a little theory. I hope it's not too painful. And then I will show you the result of what I'm talking about. The aesthetic regime of the arts does not contrast the old with the new. It contrasts more profoundly two regimes of historicity. It is within the mimemic regime that the old stands in contrast with the new. In the aesthetic regime of art, the future of art, its separation from the present of non-art, incessantly restages the past. That's a quote from Jacques Rancière. Now, Gilles Deleuze says this: if one tries to play this game other than in thought, nothing happens. If one tries to produce a result other than a work of art, nothing is produced. The game is reserved then for thought and art. End of quote. We must first begin with an understanding that there is not one conversation in play about representation, but several. And our options are not limited to one choice, but to all of them. Indeed, this heterogeneous location of our view is the play between these points of view, one with its own context. Our productive activity, shall we even say our creative process, has as its objective not merely considerations for our future production, but also for our creative view of our reading of the past. So the burden of representation being put in play here is the necessity of art to break in the experience of its own time and not simply of the past from those inherited meanings of representation which are now part of how we see. The present exhibition, Sigmund Freud and the play on the burden of representation, is the most recent addition to a series of works that goes back to the beginning of my practice in one form or another. But two installations of mine done in the early 1990s, the play of the Unsayable at the Vienna Secession and the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels for the Wittgenstein Centennial, and the play of the Unmentionable for the Brooklyn Museum in New York, were the first large institutional versions of my curated installations. And they were done, among other objectives, with the intention of rupturing the status quo of how exhibitions are made, and doing that by raising questions about the habituated, institutionalized approach to the construction of an exhibition. It is important to note that I am not an art historian, nor am I a curator. I'm an artist, and we will consider here what such a difference means. Since the beginning of my practice as an artist, I have made it clear that it is my belief that the primary material of an artist is meaning, if only as cancellation. And thus, in my work, linguistic relations between objects and images and language itself has had a primary role. Forms and colors, for example, are a used-up approach to art making, even though they may continue to be present and used for other purposes and having other meanings than they have had traditionally. A result of this understanding has often meant that the material of the work has been the context itself. At the time the Vienna Secession asked me to do the Wittgenstein exhibition, they pointed out that the Secession is perhaps the only museum in the world run with a board comprised of artists. For this reason, it was their feeling that it would be most appropriate if the Wittgenstein Centennial exhibition would be organized not by an art historian or a philosopher, but by an artist. Of course, the philosophers were squabbling, and I was the solution to it. But anyway, it was that with this perspective that I felt important questions could be asked about both exhibitions and art if an exhibition would be a work of art itself. My appropriation of the exhibition format as a form for my work clearly does change the experience of when it is a work itself. The most relevant questions about art recovered from modernism and which comprise much of postmodern practice remain ontological ones. If the exhibition you are seeing is a work of art itself comprised of other works, what is the difference? An important difference is that the artist, due to the nature of the activity, takes subjective responsibility for the surplus meaning that the show itself adds to the work presented in it. A major aspect traditionally of the art historian's practice involves objectifying what is essentially a subjective activity. And this is done by masking it with the authority of science, which our university system traditionally anoints art historians with, given that the exact sciences are the models used and the basis of university knowledge. While it is certain that scholarship and connoisseurship plays an important role in the assessment of historical work of previous centuries, but when we approach contemporary art, our priority should be more an informed understanding of the artist's intentions, with that interface with the work's reception by the viewer. Instead, with art historical practice, we have instead the imposition of judgment and objectivity. The effect of such an authoritative voice on our understanding and appreciation of a contemporary work of art is not a productive nor positive one in most cases. What is left out and experientially transformed by the perceived need to construct a cultural autobahn of masterpieces, as important as that is for the validation in the art market, it clearly has as its mission the glorification of a particular cultural order and thus a particular social order. The experience of the public of surplus meaning taking this form is clearly most often simply authority itself, with the result being naturalized and viewers depoliticized as they are distanced from the meaning-making process. What is denied is their own cultural political moment, something no longer available at that point in the cultural act of looking and thinking. My intentions in forming a curated installation for the Wittgenstein Centennial was not to promote an historical view nor engage myself with the crafting of history. Indeed, my goal was the contrary. I invited the viewer to participate with me in the reading and experience of the play, of the meaning of my juxtapositions produced. Importantly, I did not mask the event of my juxtapositions or my authorship in doing it, nor did I make claims of validity, value, or importance pertaining to the integrity of the individual works used in my installation. The point is that in viewing the relations between works provided by a context of meaning constructed by an artist, the viewer, in effect, has an invitation to participate in the meaning-making process. and by doing so also participates in a discourse permitting them to experience the process of making art itself. Keep in mind that rather than eclipsing the integrity of works by the individual artists, I was told by many viewers of both the Wittgenstein and the Brooklyn installation shows that experiencing works put in play as I did in my curated installations articulated difference in a way which made the individual works, as works by specific individuals, more visible rather than less, and articulated the terms upon which each individual work was made for each artist. Such work, then, released from being signposts of authority, are seen as the result of an artist's thinking. That is, a process, and therefore more accessible. I feel these installations provide the viewer with a sense of how art is made, and indeed, how artists think. That surplus meaning, which is my work, is in the choice of works and their form of presentation. All that which goes into that installation, which includes both the zero and not wallpapered walls, as well as the juxtaposition works by other artists, and is not unlike a writer's claim of authorship to a paragraph, comprised, as it always is, of new use of old words invented by others. I want to start with some of what I was just talking about. Harry, if you could put the Wittgenstein show and the Brooklyn one. This is the Vienna Secession. The text is by Wittgenstein, the upper one from the Investigations, and the lower one from the Tractatus. It's in Flemish because it was Belgium. It was both French and Flemish there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This actually had a practical effect in the world. When I was invited to do this, normally you do a little show in the lobby there, and I asked if I could do anything, and they said yes, and I went into the collection and did this. Well, there was the Republican right in the United States were trying to eliminate the National Endowment for funding perverse activities, et cetera. And my show and a show in Cincinnati got the laws changed because it made it clear that the law they put through was completely untenable. That our cultural history is in fact the problematic texture of our history. It is the scandals, it is the difficult work, it's the problematic things that are made. That's what informs us. The point understood concerning Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, that Oedipus played the role of representation and becomes a form produced at the end of a long genesis which defines the structure of representation, and that by emphasizing the product rather than the process of production, we end up completely misunderstanding both. Nothing could better sum up a view of the art market's conservative effect on our experiences of art and the message being sent to young artists about the nature of their chosen practice. In the logic of sense, Deleuze writes, the two types of knowledge have often been distinguished, one indifferent remaining external to its object, and the other concrete, seeking its object wherever it is. Joe Hughes has explained that these two types of knowledge are the two types of representation, dead and living. One empty and external to its object, the other concrete and which comes undone when its object escapes it. Deleuze continues by saying that representation attains this topical ideal only by means of the hidden expression which it encompasses, that is, by means of the event it envelops. Thus, there is a use of representation without which representation would remain lifeless and senseless. This is the legitimate use of representation. The representation is linked to its concrete, life-giving conditions of production through the event or idea. The idea fills this role by acting as a sort of transcendental object, and is in fact often simply called the object in the idea, or the virtual half of the object. So, the material of an installation is first a psychological and social experience provided by the room's architecture. This results from the meaning of the social and cultural history of its use, along with the combined experience of the psychology of that particular architectural context added to our prior architectural experience. We know and experience that while we also know we are standing in the world. We also know in a museum or gallery that, like anything else, its being there could be of limited duration, but we suspend that understanding. The world, as that location, that institution or place of cultural activity, will change and continue in another way. This location in time provides temporary installations that texture of history, which is part of one's more immediate experience of them. There are other aspects to permanent installations which make them valuable in another way. But to understand both better, we must begin with the temporary. The point is that an installation work, even a temporary one, insofar as the experience of the work goes, is attached to a location, is fixed as part of the architecture, and seals its fate along with the history and culture of that one location in the world. The implication being quite unlike the free-floating object that transcends any particular place, finding its aura in the market on its way to the final resting place of the heavenly museum. It is the loss of the sense of self with modernist absorption which removes the viewer from the here and now and makes the experience of the fictive space of painting and sculpture even possible. Why installations are so intrinsically linked with this understanding of postmodernism is that their commitment to a location links them to the here and now and is yet discursively part of what makes them art. And as such, as art, they can do so while they remain in the world. One cannot hope to prescribe work having an engagement with questions concerning the production of meaning to always turn out results that are either well designed and aesthetically pleasing along the lines of long received criteria of attraction and market desirability, nor with any less or more likelihood should we expect a rigorous and prescriptive form of visible uncanniness, of demonstrating an ugly or non-art gravitas to be a part of the experience either. Such an insistence ultimately functions as a form of style. How one makes a work must be in the service of why it is being made. To that end, a work can look like anything at all, including not necessarily being visible at all. Beyond the signifying needs inherent in how the work must manifest itself and what is required for it to construct the meaning that it does, how it looks really doesn't matter beyond its role in that requirement. We do know that historically new art, when it is making a contribution to the history of ideas, that often doesn't look like art. Driven primarily by artistic intention, such work, if judgment is the issue, must be judged by its own standards, those standards required for the work's reception which permit it to be put into play culturally. The viewer-reader must also be armed, apparently, with the admonition that seeing isn't as simple as looking. The postmodern project, however, out of the process of an etymological-like formative historical path of growth within culture, has internalized a carried-over feature of modernism. This can be seen to be that art requires a self-definition, even if a continually transformatory one, to be put in play in the service of maintaining the recognition of itself, that of having a quality of transitory autonomy. This feature is a necessary one for art to be readable and meaningful in a given cultural and historical moment. This is the operative play of art, and is part of the nature of the dynamic of its own inherent cultural force to self-describe itself in relation to the world in which it finds itself, even if always in a way which is subject to revision by the practitioners of culture themselves who must embrace it. It is this internal drive of an art toward implicit autonomy that provides its traction with the world. Art's ultimate refusal to participate with the world as a knowing partner within the context of other meanings, corporate, religious, entertainment, et al., is how it preserves and maintains its own particular, even if non-prescriptive character. Viral life, like as Felix Gonzalez Torres put it so eloquently, art's paradoxical dialectic requires that it must take on the forms and meanings of the world of the living, and borrowing freely, as part of a dynamic of an interior order which protects its identity as something other than the world in order to make meaning for the living in the world. That which distinguishes the actual production of art from that of paintings by monkeys or the drawings of children is that intentional act manifesting a specific kind of meaning, art, which within human cultural and social meaning, one which necessitates an individual's intention of taking subjective responsibility for that act, and without which such an activity can have no political life. Without such a profile of autonomy, art could never see itself. That is, it would lose its self-reflexivity, and thus its capacity as a critical and political force within culture. Or as Gaston Bachelard put it, as soon as art has become autonomous, it makes a fresh start. In this way, art manifests itself as a continual and dialectical new beginning. As part of its own autonomous spiral, it must be able to see itself, which also means to see the world in itself as it proceeds. This self-reflexive moment constitutes in culture the basis for its political life, as a critical space and a transformatory moment within its role as part of the production of consciousness itself. And as it does so, human intention takes on its role as a producer of meaning along with the subjective responsibility of having done so, and thereby anchors the cultural discourse of which it is a part to the historical moment in which it happens. It is this which gives art its authenticity, both in the present and for future generations. Thanks. So, now, show and tell. Here we are. A little slower, Harry. Slower. I feel under some moral obligation, ethical duty, to provide the names of the artists, which once was here but aren't anymore. I don't know what happened to that. Here we are.
Got the floor plan.
Well, it's a floor plan, you see, and there's a lot of artists. I used the work of 70 artists. They were, there's a lot of Austrian artists because the 21st House is part of the Belvedere Museum, and they have a very large collection, and I was free to go through it to find works I could use. So we'll just keep moving a little bit. Maybe you can play a game with yourself and see if you can figure out who these artists are. Most of them are known, but not all of them. This is a former student of mine, who's I'm trying to remember right now. What happened to you? Mark Dion, sorry, Mark. Hans Ulrich, Son Marander. It's a real play and mix.
And the show is still on.
It's on until the middle of January.
I can go and see it.
Yes, please do. Okay, move. This is Damien Hirst. You're all familiar with him. I never thought I'd be putting a work of Damien's in a show of mine, so it was kind of fun. Gavin Turk, that was Sarah Lucas. Boker, Gavin Turk. John Baldessari over there.
And how did it come about with Freud? I mean, we're going to talk about it later, but because you were invited back to Vienna, so it's obviously...
Yeah, I did it for the 50th anniversary of the death of Freud. They invited me into the Sigmund Freud Museum, and I was given the bedroom and the space of the institution, and I did this work, this was in the 80s when I was doing works on Freud, which is a text of Freud which is canceled and used as wallpaper. Douglas Gordon. Susan Hiller, who's going to be speaking in this series later. Paul McCartney. Very spotty of me, I know, but. I don't know if anybody ever put them together before. I was really thinking what a great thing to combine would be Cindy and Francesca.
They could have met.
I wonder. I mean, I knew them both.
Yeah.
I knew Francesca too. But. Former students of mine also.
So you never stopped working on Freud, really, because I found this quote.
Well,
I
did 10 years, and I found myself in Freud's bedroom doing this work, and I said, you know, if I don't stop here, I'll be doing Freud the rest of my life. So that was really the last official work I did on Freud. And Mike Kelly's always presented in a certain way, and I wanted to present him another way. And he did these two works, which are incredibly, one's based on the other, but total different treatments. And his room was only these two works. Change? Yeah. The show was quite large. It was half of the museum, so it just went on and on. So this was one room which I presented. I did something like 14 around the world of this zero knot work, the wallpaper. So this was a slideshow that showed all the different permutations. And this was an edition I did for Vienna, which paid for actually the making of the wallpaper for the Freud Museum, because there, of course, was no funds to do it. So it was the same as the wallpaper that was used.
So that was already in '89, the zero knot, right? In the
yeah, it was from zero knot began in '85, and it was the last half. The Freud work began in '81.
But I wanted to ask you that later, but as we are now here in the middle of it, what prompted the kind of zero knot epiphany? Can you tell us how that idea?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't get very mechanical about its process. These things, I wanted to be a kind of palimpsest, a kind of there but not there, sort of struggle for comprehension, struggle to construct the meaning, you know. And you can just barely do it. Some are more successful than others in that regard, but. So then, in the 50th anniversary of the death of Freud, I was given all of his living part to do this. It was supposed to be up for 3 months, and it was up for 7 years. And then I wanted to put the work of other artists, and so I began a foundation with Peter Pakish and the director of the Freud Museum, Strasser. And it was, I had basically called my friends up and said, would you please donate a work for the Sigmund Freud Museum collection? And so that's pretty much how all the work has come into the collection.
That's actually interesting because here the curating was a kind of a production of reality. It sort of created something permanent. Yeah.
This is Franz West's couch. These are usually installed in the Sigmund Freud Museum. There's a wing which was Anna Freud, his daughter's practice, which was focused on children. And these works are often up and seen in the Sigmund Freud Museum. So we took them out for this installation. This is Chaim Steinbach. This is Wolfgang Berkowski, another former student of mine, proudly I say. Jessica, let's see. This is Kling Gutmann again because they're in the collection. John Baldessari, Georg Herold. These are, it's a well-known work by Sherry Levine, which are children's shoes, which she gave me because it was in the children's wing, shall we say, of Anna Freud. This is Susan Heller's donation to the Foundation collection. This is Pierpaolo Cazzolari. And this is Heimo Zobring.
Now to talk about, and it's again something I wanted to ask you later, but it pops up here. I quoted Hamilton at the beginning and said, like, we mainly remember exhibitions which invent a new display feature. So could we say here the wallpaper is the display feature?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. It goes back to, I was already doing that in the 60s.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a very, for me, this is Ilya Kabakov, and that's Jenny Holzer over there. So these are examples of one of each of the different series I did throughout the 80s based on Freud. This is called Fetishism Corrected, and what it is the galley of Freud's book on fetishism that he made hand corrections, and then I blew up those corrections in neon. This is a work called Hypercathexis. The first work in the series was called Cathexis, and I'll show you one of those around the corner. But anyway, it's fragments of archaic, in many cases, ancient language. This is from 14th century French. This is Cathexis, which was the first of the Freud works. I had never heard of this guy named Baselitz when I did it. But there was a return to painting, which I was sort of sneering at. And I had to do something about this return to painting, which I thought was historically ridiculous thing to be happening. And so I started doing this I had a show at the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart. So I went in and I had photos taken of works in the collection, which sort of scandalized, I suppose, the curator of that collection, that part of the collection. But so it's upside down, and then I wrote a text which is sort of inside out, and the two are in play together. Unfortunately, the neon is not photographed well. You have to photograph neon, you have to do a double exposure, one of the wall and one of the but they don't know that. So. And I wasn't there. You're stuck. So this work, I asked the photographer who knew my work to take some photos by certain instructions. And then he sent me these photos which were terrible, and they looked like somebody trying to interpret my work. So I found a photographer who'd never heard of me and gave him the job and told him what I was looking for. And he did a series of photos that had the elements in them I wanted in a naive way, so to say, and then I was able to use them. This is a work called Fort Da, and it's much too strange to explain right now. So Clay and Gutmann, former students of mine, who were showing in the East Village Gallery, Jay Garney, and they were doing they did still lifes. You saw the books, for example, landscapes and portraits. And they said, Joseph, we want to do something with you, but I don't know what you do. And I said, well, very easy. I'll do word, sentence, and paragraph, which is what these works are. All part of the Zero and Not series. This is all from Freudiana. This is from a museum in Berlin, but I can't remember which one. No, that wasn't so painful, was it?
So we're obviously going to come back to this exhibition, but I thought it could be great to explore that whole idea of you and curating, you know, sort of from the beginning. This is something which played a role ever since the 60s. But before that, I wanted to talk about the very beginning, because you started extremely early, age of 9. And I was kind of wondering if you can tell us about the first kind of epiphany. What brought you to art? How did art come to you? What can you tell us about that? The very beginning.
Depending on your class location, I think that if you're a screwed up introvert, you either go into crime or you go into art. And if you're, you know, a middle class or better, then you go into art and you put it and you do something productive of it. But I've always felt a great affinity between for children who were put in situations and how they survive, and what are the things you can do to find your way in the world, right? And so it's almost a linguistic problem that one, in terms of one's cultural vision that you're given, whether you find yourself going on one of those tracks or the other. We won't take this as a very serious social theory, but it's a kind of feeling I've had. I was always, from the second grade, the school artist, for better or for worse. And for me, there was no question about what I wanted to do with my life and where I would go. I mean, it took different forms. I was a school cartoonist. You know, you'd go through different permutations of your options. But by the time I was about 9 and 10, I started going to museum school, and I had studied under a Belgian landscape painter, and learned traditional stuff, and ended up getting some sort of attention as a child. But
as a wunderkind.
Yeah. Well, I never really thought of it that way. I mean, I was in Ohio, for God's sake, and it's really all about sports. So, as a kid left out of my basic social context, art was sort of saved me, basically. Yeah.
And you started very early to exhibit, and by the age of 25, you already had dozens and dozens of exhibitions. I was kind of wondering where, because I always kind of remember it's kind of in the early 90s when I was friends with Felix González Torres. He always talked about the impact you had on him and on his thinking.
Who was it?
Felix González Torres.
Oh, Felix, yeah.
And we often talked about you with him, and it was actually interesting because my last project with him was a book where he wanted to kind of publish all his instructions for the pieces, and he wanted to dedicate that book to you. And it's still an unrealized book. We hope we're going to, one day be able to realize it was somehow a book he wanted to do. And at the same time, 10 years later, I met Tino Segal, and he again mentioned you as an influence. They both said something very similar. They said it's kind of this definition of, you talk about production of meaning, to not work with, forms or colors, but with meaning. I was kind of wondering, because that's something which dawned on you very, very early. And I was wondering where you would then begin your catalogue raisonné. If you did by 25 already so many shows, what's the number one in your catalogue raisonné? What's the first work where you felt you had reached a production of meaning?
Well, I think it has to do also with who my heroes were. Duchamp was one, Ed Reinhardt was another. And so if there were any contradictions between them, I was sort of, I think, resolving them. I had some very I had the fortune at a very young age to meet amazing people, and I got to know Ed Reinhardt, and he took me to lunch once with Rothko when I was like 19 or 20, and they had a knockout, drag-out fight. It was in a place called Brownie's, which was a health food restaurant. In fact, Ed died about 2 or 3 years later from a heart attack. So I know why we were there, but the fight was horrible. And I was like a kid, and I didn't quite understand what the issues were. I often thought it'd be great to go into hypnosis and find out what they were fighting about. And I thought it was about art. And then years later, I found out that Rothko was having an affair with Ed's wife. So, you know, the world's sometimes simpler than you imagine. But it was similar. I was taken to dinner with Sartre and Beauvoir and about 9 other people. And I always said, and I was 19, and Simone de Beauvoir sat next to me and really took care of me because she knew this kid had no business being at this dinner. And but I was so amazed by this woman, and when her 3-volume autobiography came out, I went out and bought it, and I think the youngest and first male feminist in New York, I think, because it really had a big effect. But this is the thing about, I would take people to my studio and show them what I was doing, and one well-known critic, she said, "Oh, Joseph, come on. I mean, you're not even 30. You're not a real artist, at least until you're 30." So I realized from that I had to keep my age a secret. So I told no one my age until it works like 1 in 3 chairs in MoMA, or the Clockwork I have in here at the Tate, which was in the opening show. All that series of work I did when I was 20. Now, they would never have bought that work if they knew it was the work of a 20-year-old. So when I was 28, I had a kind of retrospective, at least politely called a survey show, at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris. And at the press conference, I let everyone know I was 28. But because I figured by then I was in all the major museum collections I could think of. And what can they do about it, you know? But it was a scandal. It really was a scandal. I mean, now the art dealers stand outside the art schools waiting to grab a student. But it wasn't like that then at all. But I got away with it. That's the important part.
So by 20, you did this major piece, and that's really sort of in a way in the mid-60s. And I was kind of wondering, because often when I speak to scientists, I interviewed Benoit Brandelbrot about how he discovered fractals. He remembered the kind of rainy Tuesday or Wednesday when on a sort of blurry, not clean blackboard he suddenly saw fractals. Or when I interviewed Albert Hoffman, he remembered exactly the day, the hour when in his lab he suddenly discovered LSD. So scientists usually can mark this kind of moment of invention. So I was kind of really curious because this incredible, epiphany you had to have an object, a photo of an object, and then the dictionary.
Well, no, it was very simple.
When did that come to you?
It came to me because, my second interest was always philosophy, and philosophy, particularly Wittgenstein, gave me a way out of being a painter and being, as Duchamp always said, in French we always say, stupid like a painter. And I didn't want to be stupid, he said. And I felt kind of the same way. So particularly the late Wittgenstein was very influential. And I had trying to figure out a way. I believed in art. I didn't believe in painting and sculpture and what we now understand was the modernist conventions of the limits of the media, that art is a media-defined activity. And I no longer believed in that, but I did believe in art. So I had a dream, I have to confess. I had a dream in which I did 1 in 3 chairs. I confess publicly now. And it was a resolution in my head of these things I was thinking and reading about. And, so my apologies to Magritte. What can I say?
Such a great answer. And when did then curating enter? Because we looked at these important shows, of course, the Wittgenstein show in '89, which I went as a student on a pilgrimage to Vienna. But you curated shows long before, already in the '60s. And earlier, when we met for coffee before the talk, you said that the beginning of your curating was actually a show of books. Show. Can you tell us about that first show?
Well, I was still in art school. I was in the School of Visual Art. And I had a cousin who was a drug dealer. That's what he did. And in fact, he invented window pane LSD, if you've ever heard of it. But and he came and he came to visit me, and the family had given up on him, and he was in and out of jail and stuff. And but he was my favorite cousin. And so he had he said, I'm going to stay here and New York. And I said, great, great. And he had a beard down to his knees, and he was coming from San Francisco. This is the 60s. You get the mood, you get the atmosphere. Okay. And he ended up, he'd brought, I think, something like 40 kilos of marijuana to New York City, which is why he was well funded. And he decided he saw this amazing space that had been closed, Art Deco space in New York, and he decided to rent it and do a poster gallery. Well, I had one look at it, and I said, Lannis, wouldn't you like to be part of art history? I mean, I was a kid in art school. I had no business saying it. And so I convinced him to sleep in the back and keep the place clean, and I would do exhibitions there. And so I began to do these exhibitions. And the first one I did, which I thought of as my first one-person show, was I invited 15 people to present their favorite book. And for example, Ed Reinhardt gave me the art history book. He cut the images out of for his famous cartoons. So he came to my studio and he saw all these dictionaries with holes in them. And he laughed and he said, I've got a book like that at home. So he gave me that. And I had Smithson and a whole list of artists. Robert Morris gave me the Yellow Pages. Anyway, a long list of 15 artists. And so that was the first show. And then I did a show of normal art. And you know, this was a very shoestring thing. My cousin, with his drug money, and they got a job as a bartender at a place called the, what was it called? It was on the most famous sort of hippie street in the West Village. But anyway, he was a bartender there. And he sort of supported this activity. I mean, we only did 4 shows. But people do the PhD on it now. This is the hilarious part. What?
No, but it's interesting because it's a show of the book, but then there is also, it's the East Village Gallery, which then you sort of named the Museum of Normal Art.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
And different shows happen there, and I mean, that's you as an impresario, you as a curator. Can you tell us about that museum and what happened, and why was it called the Museum of Normal Art?
Normal as in normative. Yeah. My idea was to teach what real art was. And remember, we still had a lot of expressionism, a lot of things. You know, it was a period of Greenberg and Freud, and where they were being very prescriptive about what art could be. And all the things I was interested in, they said wasn't art, you know. So that was the kind of response to that. I wrote, a couple years later, Art After Philosophy. And that was interesting because I got invited, I presented this about, I don't know, 6 or 7 art schools in the UK. And it had a really big effect at the time. There were curriculums that were actually changed based on my thing. I had I remember I gave it at St. Martin's, it was standing room only. And about a month later, Greenberg came to give a speech, and the students there organized speakers on the roof, and they read my text over Greenberg so nobody could hear him, things like that. It was nice to be a force for good.
And at that time there was also a connection to art and language. You were, I mean, that's another activity or editor. Can you tell us about that?
My deranged antisocial cousins, yes. No, you know, I couldn't, the New York artists were, you know, very committed to modernism in whatever form that would take. I had a hard time having the kind of conversations that were by people informed with certain philosophical ideas, et cetera, there. And when I heard about them and they made contact, Terry Atkinson came and visited me, and we became good friends, and we remain good friends to this day. I realized that there were these people I could talk to. But then, unfortunately, there's a certain personality dysfunctionality and xenophobia in the group that made it very difficult. And they were always against my having my own art career, which I kind of had some fondness toward. I had my own practice, and I was interested in continuing it. So it was sort of like about like early political formation in the United States, states' rights or federalist. You know, they really wanted me to be one of the boys, and I never liked to be one of the boys. So our relationship was bumpy until it collapsed. But Terry Atkinson left very early because he didn't approve of the direction the group was going. And in the end, they began, and the painting returned in the early 80s, they returned to painting, which was everything that we fought against in terms of the basis of why they did those paintings anyway. So anyway, that's that. It's really old story.
But what is interesting is that you then, obviously, besides all these curatorial activities and group activities, start to appear in all these shows. There is by telephone, there is When Attitudes Become Form. You're in all these great, legendary late 60s shows. But in terms of curating, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the information room, because that's another form of, one can say, curated space, because there it's more than 15 books. It's these two long wooden tables, there are all these paperbacks, there is structural anthropology, there is linguistics, there is psychoanalysis, there are stacks of newspapers, and it's a sort of a curated information room. Can you tell us about the information room?
That room, by the way, is going into the collection of the Walker.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it was remade also a couple of years ago, no? It was
well, not exactly. I mean, these things are always, there's never an original in the sense, there's the validated one, I say, this is the work, based on what it was originally. But like in the case of Duchamp, there's no sort of original, truth of the matter. But it was the first institutional presentation of conceptual art. It was called Conceptual Art and Conceptual Aspects. So there was like, what I was actually ghost curating it for a man named Donald Karshan, with the help of Mel Ramsden and Ian Byrne, who were also living in New York. And I did this, I wanted to sort of explicate what this idea of art could be and what the issues were. And so making a division. So I put in artists, new artists relatively, who were doing things that were related to the activity. That's conceptual aspects. And then there was the group of more hardcore conceptual artists, you know. And it was, and this was before the MoMA information show. But everybody knew this was like so we say, something coming, and they had to deal with it one way or the other. I also did, a guy named Jack Burnham did a show called Software around the same time at the Jewish Museum. So those were, you know, the institutions dealing with this activity, which the collectors could care less about. I mean, you know, who wants pieces of paper push-pinned on the wall, or photos, or people howling in the middle of the room, or videos, or all the rest of it? You know, I mean, it's not nearly as, it's not decorative, it doesn't go over the couch well. And the Greenbergian line was art, high late modernism was making essentially neckties for over the couch. And I felt this was really not the direction art should go. So it was a struggle over ideas in that time, for sure.
And a sort of whole exhibition history, there's obviously a kind of amnesia of exhibition history still now. I mean, Eric Hobsbawm talked about the necessity to protest against forgetting, and it's fascinating how the exhibition, with its limited lifespan, with the fact that it's not collected, I mean, very rarely an exhibition gets collected or held together. So there is amnesia, but I mean, now there is more information, but I suppose at that time, in the sort of 60s and early 70s, there wasn't that much information on the whole sort of avant-garde history of exhibitions. I was kind of wondering how you connected to that, and what were the kind of key exhibitions, because I saw that, for example, there's a reference to the Armory show in one of the shows. How did you connect to that sort of history of 20th century?
What was really important was that, and I think that this has been understood and appreciated, was to separate the unassisted ready-mades of Duchamp's work from the Dada history, and see that as asking really serious ontological questions about the nature of art and what our activity was. And that and I did that, and that was of course in Art After Philosophy and these things. And from that came a really changed understanding of the importance of Duchamp. There was a really great thing, and I was stupid and I didn't do it, but the Centre Pompidou approached me. They've received a whole lot of Duchamp editions, which is all there really is of Duchamp. And that's not in museums, I mean. And so they asked me, listen, we want to do a double show. Richard Hamilton will do the modernist Duchamp, and you will do the postmodern Duchamp. You know, well, I was in the middle of a discussion with another museum in Paris about a show, and I got affected by art politics, and this was actually a show of acquisitions, and it wasn't. I just I know how museums work, and once okay, we got a Kossuth show, and that would be it for 10, 15 years, and so I made a really bad decision, not true to myself, and turned it down.
So that's unrealized.
It was unrealized, but it would have been great, and I'm sorry I didn't do it. And I apologize to Sandra Pompidou over and over again. But anyway.
Are there any other unrealized exhibitions you wanted to do and you haven't done? Or?
Oh, yes. Well, I have one, but I haven't done it yet, so I can't talk about it. But and I think it will get done. Now I can, I kind of have the possibility of convincing people to do it. But, when I was younger, it wasn't like that at all.
Now, one thing which is also interesting if one looks at your curated exhibitions and in a way, in the 80s, obviously, the art world starts to expand a lot, and that sort of becomes bigger and bigger. The exhibition becomes bigger. And there is this notion in German of the Großausstellung, which when I entered the art world as a student in the late 80s, everybody talked about Großausstellung. It was kind of, it wasn't the age of the Biennale.
Blockbuster.
Yeah, blockbuster, kind of large-scale exhibitions.
Yeah.
And the Biennale age in the 90s kind of then eclipsed the Großausstellung because it became, every city started to have a Biennale. But in the 80s, it was this moment of Harald Zeeman and Caspar Koenig doing these, large-scale exhibitions. And in an interesting way, with your 89 and 1990, in very short time, you started to do much, much bigger shows, to curate these bigger shows. Yeah. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about this and about beginning with this 89 show, the play of the Ensemble, the Wittgenstein show, and this invitation from the Vienna Secession. We saw the images before. It was an incredibly dense exhibition. There's obviously the wallpaper, and then there are these different layers of, I spent about 6 hours in that show, and it was a really super dense exhibition.
It was very funny. We did the catalog, which was quite a big thing, and they said, well, we're going. I said, how many are you publishing? They, 5,000 we think will be plenty. I said, you're wrong. And it turned out that they were all sold out by 4 days after the show opened. So the exhibition went on for a couple of months with no catalog available, because they said, Kossuth, Wittgenstein, that's not a seller, So it was very nice to confound that.
And it was just after Hollein had done Traum und Wirklichkeit, the kind of a blockbuster Hans Hollein had done about the whole moment of early 20th century.
Well, also when I did when it traveled to the Palais de Beaux-Arts in Brussels, that was the time that Sigmund did that show in Hamburg at the what is that big institution in Hamburg?
Deichtorhallen?
The Deichtorhallen. And his budget was 20 times more than mine, and his show was smaller, and mine was getting critical acclaim. And Harry was an old pro, in fact, an old friend of mine. Was getting sort of not well received because it was very much it was really quite conventional, and I had a tremendous respect for him. He put me in his first Documenta. He gave me a major role in it, and but then we stayed together. And then at a certain point in the early '80s, the things were changing. And it was a return to painting, and he and Achille Bonito Oliva did a conversation in, I don't know, maybe Flash Art, in which they targeted me as the view that was now over, And but meanwhile, I had artists coming up to me in the street in Soho, saying, "Joseph, you have to say something. It's terrible what's going on, this return to painting, etc." I mean, it was the real beginning of the flexing of the muscle of the art market in the meaning-making process. And the artists hadn't really quite experienced that. The art world had finally grown to the point, and the power of galleries and power of collectors was such that it was really transforming the terrain in which artists were working. And that was the beginning. I wrote something, if you want to look it up, in the early 80s in Art Forum. It's called Necrophilia Mon Amour. And it's about this return.
But it's interesting because by the time these two big shows happen, it's the late 80s, and that's the beginning actually of again a kind of a different moment now, because it kind of was the stock exchange crash. It's the beginning. I mean, Tim Berners reinvented the internet. It's the beginning of Felix Gonzalez Torres. It's the idea of no longer struggling for wall space. It's time becoming more important. And you do this exhibition in Vienna. So I was kind of interested because you read this text, theoretical text about curating installation. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about some of the issues which come up in relation to that show, to that 89 show in the Wittgenstein show. Because, for example, this idea of that there is not one conversation in play, but that there are these several conversations in play, that was very strong. The idea also of the layering, because you've got not only the layering with the text and the wallpaper, but then on top of it all the works. So I was just wondering if you can tell a little bit about these different conversations, these different representations. Also, I was wondering if you had a master plan for that show, or if it sort of happened whilst you installed it.
Both. I had a basic idea what I wanted to do, but it was really in play. When I was doing it, some things worked better, and I went that way or that way, And then when it went to the Palais de Beaux-Arts, it was 2.5 times bigger because the museum was that much bigger, and it wasn't one box of a room like the Vienna Secession. It was a series of rooms and so it was. I found out what it was like to curate when I would choose certain things, and then we would find out that they would find out that it would be the Palais de Beaux-Arts, which is basically a Kunsthalle without a collection. Well, museums that have a collection don't want to loan to museums without a collection because it's a cost, it's a bother, and they can't go to them and borrow something from them after. So they have a hard time justifying it. And I found out this kind of the daily working life of curators, and a lot of it, or some collectors, any damage they wanted the full value. So the insurance was going way up, and our budget was, These are adult questions I didn't want to deal with. I was an artist playing with my crayons, So it was, but I adapted myself to the task because I really wanted certain things in the show, and I would call up the director, and persuade them or yell at them or whatever was indicated, and most of the times I won. I was happy to say, but not every curator I suppose can do that. I don't know.
And can you tell us about the way you kind of then navigated Wittgenstein's oeuvre? And I mean, how did the selection of the text happen? How did you choose? How did that selection? Because it wasn't only the selection of the work there, because that's
it's very hard to do that without standing in front of the works in relation to the particular text, because they were in play together,
Yeah.
But the whole idea of doing that, of putting, there was only one artist who pulled out.
And who was that?
Carl Andre. We've had a friendly fight for decades. And he said, Joseph, if you're doing it, it's conceptual art, and my work has nothing to do with that. And he insisted his work got pulled out. So I said, fine. It was the only, but all the artists were actually quite happy to be in it and thought what I was doing was interesting. But.
And you also invited the viewer to participate. I mean, you said in relation to all your shows that it's important to invite the viewer to participate in the reading, in the experience of the play, in the meaning, the juxtaposition. Obviously, Duchamp says the viewer does 50% of the work. Dominique First said a couple of weeks ago, at least 50% of the work. Can you tell us a little bit about how in shows you make the viewer sort of participate, how that works?
Well, it's so much in our culture is about passive consumption, that we give cultural meaning making to cultural professionals, artists, whoever, and directors of the movies and whatever, and so people just passively consume. I felt it was really important that for art that doesn't happen, that people are obliged to think, and they have to connect to the work by using it in some constructing another view, And one of the problems of a lot of art, these more traditional work, is that it presents itself as a whole model of the world in a way, and you take it all or you don't take it at all. And I think that it was a little bit the kinds of things we work with. It reminds me, there was a discussion of Levi-Strauss talking about myths, that You know, it's like somebody was with you and they're crossing the Autobahn, Autostrada, what is it? The highway, yes. And you remember you want them to pick up a pack of cigarettes. So you yell it out different ways, the traffic is loud. You make gestures. Well, no one thing got the message across, but it's the overlap of all the fragmented different kinds of messages that puts across the message. And in a similar way, I don't want to do one work a la Hegel or Kant that is a whole worldview, right? I think that it's a process in which fragments construct the kinds of meaning, and they show in a more elliptical way the kinds of Wittgensteinian sense of showing rather than asserting. I guess that would be the best way of saying it. And so that's what I try to do with my works and my shows, as much as I can. And so for somebody who's the viewer coming, okay, that's like the hook.
We've only just begun.
The hook where they pull you off the stage. Okay, well, that was a conversation stopper.
Anyway, but we are sort of...
anyway, you know,
we can go slightly longer. I hope we have so many more questions. Now, it's good that you mentioned Levi-Strauss, because there was kind of actually one of my most challenging interviews, because he was almost 100 years old, and I went to see him. And he said, I really do not want to do another interview unless you can ask me something no one has ever asked before. Read every single interview I've ever given. So that was kind of a challenge, because he had given interviews for 70 years. I read everything. And then we found out
you were 10 years older and you went back to him.
Exactly. And then we realized that he had never talked about his sort of models of actually, he made these little models on his table where he spatialized text into three-dimensional objects. And the cleaning person had thrown them all away, so only one survived.
Oh my God.
And so we talked about that, you know, one model and that idea of actually making, kind of bringing, you know, space in, you know, text into space. And it's very connected to what you do with the show. So that's kind of an interesting link. But I wanted to ask you more about, as we had need to advance in the chronology, about the play of the Unmentionable at the Brooklyn Museum, because that was a year after. And with that exhibition, you alluded to it and you showed us there was a very, very strong political dimension to that, and it created a huge debate. So you tell us a little bit more about how that came about and how that invitation, because there are precedents for that. I mean, Andy Warhol was invited to do that show called Raid the Icebox, so where he blundered in a way that was somehow maybe connected to that, but it's rare the occasion that an artist can just take an entire museum.
Well, basically they invited, but that's like somebody, a house guest who ends up taking over the house. I mean, they invited me into the lobby. It was a $10,000 budget, which is, you know, it was a long time ago, but still it wasn't much money. And I said, can I do anything I want? And they said, sure, sure. So I decided to make it look like the Met, you know, to paint it up in the institutional gray and to do a very straight show, shall we say, and go into the collection and pull out all the things that are problematic. You know, furniture that the Nazis thought were morally indefensible. I mean, there was incredible, I mean, if I had the slides up, there's some amazing things they showed. They had, for example, against Mapplethorpe, there was a man named Wildman, who was head of the American Family Foundation, said there was nothing culturally redeeming about the work of Mapplethorpe, and the photograph of a man urinating into a man's mouth was, he found particularly upsetting. Well, I found a 12th century Arabic painting of exactly that, you know, in the collection of the museum. And that's the kind of thing I did. I went through and I pulled out things that the Republicans were basically saying this isn't art and this is, you know, schmut or whatever, and showed how important a lot of this stuff has been in our cultural history. The painters who were thrown out of for painting nudes. I mean, there was one painter, amazing, who claimed that he specialized in painting naked children because the children, of course, there's nothing sexual about them. They actually said that. And then he ran off with one of the girls that he was painting, so that sort of put the lie to that. But I had Larry Clark's Teenage Lust, the portfolio there. And I put you know, lots of juxtapositions of this kind that really showed how our culture, the important things in our culture, began as a scandal and ruptured certain conventional ways of thinking, created new meanings for the people alive at that time. And that's an important part of any kind of cultural production.
And that idea also of an artist coming into a museum and then producing new meaning by creating a rupture, with the way the collection is read is always super exciting. And you did that many, many times afterwards. There's also the case
but
of
you had
Isabella's.
to go in the case of Brooklyn, when I realized there were all these department heads in the Brooklyn Museum. It's an enormous museum. And that I had to get them on my side. So I did a model in my studio, twice the size of the stage, I think, in which I invited them, all the curators of the different parts, to my studio on Broadway in New York. And I did my pitch, so why I needed certain works. Because for them, some of them weren't the best examples they didn't want to bring out, but I needed them for other reasons. And in the end, and the chief curator, and I convinced them. But then, of course, the budget was 50,000 rather than 10. So the directors and I had a chat, and he said, the show is going to be fantastic, but the city's almost bankrupt. It was at that time. And you're going to have to sign for it personally. We're going to have to do deficit spending. And I said, where do I sign, right? So I did this thing. In the end, I was on CNN for a week being interviewed. I was at 2 full pages in the New York Times, front page Arts and Leisure, which is a big deal if you're a New Yorker. I broke the attendance records of the museum, and it was my biggest public blockbuster. And nobody worried about the 50,000 anymore, because maybe the accountants would, but in terms of why the museum's there, the budget doesn't matter if the show's a success, right?
He completely woke up the museum, because at that time Brooklyn Museum was,
well, we really put them on the map. But then, of course, 4 or 5 years go by, maybe not that long, and the city goes bankrupt, and there's a big problem. So the trustees say, hey, this guy owes us $40,000. We should go after him.
No.
Yeah. And the director fought, and he said, but he worked for the board, and he said, okay. So they said, we have to pay this money. And I said, I'm bankrupt too, along with the city. I don't have it, but I'll give you a work worth more than that. And they said, no, it's another department. And I said, well, sue me, Well, I had all this publicity that was so positive, they couldn't sue me. So they were stuck, and nothing happened. For about 1.5 years later, Bob Buck, who was the director of the museum, calls me and says, Joseph, the most amazing thing happened. I said, what's that? He said, a little old lady died and gave us $40,000 to buy a work of temporary art. And so, we exchanged checks, and I paid for it with our work in the end, But if I had worried about the budget and worried about the money, it never would have happened,
And it happened many times.
Unfortunately, I live my life that way too, which sometimes is a problem.
It happened many times after. There's the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum also, where you basically mixed up the whole collection. Can you tell us very quickly?
Which one?
The Gardner Museum.
Yeah. Well, I was the centennial artist for this Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which is it's a really amazing museum if you ever are in Boston, because this woman would have been an artist if she hadn't been a society lady and a lady at the time. She made incredible installations, and she had a guy named Bernard Berenson. She sent off to Europe with a camera, and he photographed works and mailed the photographs. And she bought the first collector to do it from her photographs. And she put together this incredible collection, and she installed everything a certain way, to the extent that in her will, if anything would be moved, the whole collection had to be sold and the money given to Harvard University. So out of some sense of institutional masochism, they invited me in as the centennial artist to work with the collection, which I couldn't move, but I managed to do things. And it was, in the end, it worked out great, and I learned a lot from it, and they were very happy with it.
Can you tell us about 1 or 2 things you did there which were particularly
Well, there were 3 things. There were basically 3 things. One, there was a big, we had to work with a lawyer because they had to be sure that it wouldn't violate the basis of the trust, and they'd have to sell it all and give it to Harvard in the museum. So of course that was a concern. So, and I never had to work with a lawyer before when I was doing, So I pulled things out of the collection. There were these vitrines, and I which had cloths. So I had embroidered texts on the cloths. We remade them, like the other ones. And then there was a big wall that went around, and there was a wonderful lecture that Whistler gave about collectors. And so I did a neon work on that wall that went around the museum. But Boston is extremely cold in the winter. It was so cold, and I never had this experience working all over the world with neon, that I had to have a team of 6 guys with hair dryers on extension cords behind the wall. So when nobody was looking at the work, they'd run out and warm up the neon. This is during the opening only, of course. But it was, funny little backstage stories. Isn't that wonderful?
Then maybe 2 last questions. The whole Wittgenstein story continued, basically followed you then throughout the 90s and until now through this whole guest and foreigner series. There was obviously Wittgenstein in Norway, there was Wittgenstein in Ireland. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about that, because I think it's incredibly significant in relation to what's happening in Europe right now. In my last conversation with Edouard Glissant, he was very basically alerted about the sort of new nationalisms which are popping up everywhere, and he was saying that we should take the Antillean archipelago really as a model, because in this archipelago the idea of creolization is there, the blending, but also it's not continents, it's archipelago, the idea that actually neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once for all, that we change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting, which sounds urgent for now. But you've done this guest and foreigner series, which I think is very...
Well, the guest and foreigner series began when I was invited to do a retrospective and it was 2 big halls in the Kunstnerhus in Oslo. And so for the new work, I wanted to do this thing called Guests and Foreigners, based on an Austrian philosopher named Hans Ulrich Obrist, where he talked about the relationship between being a guest or being a foreigner. And so I began with that, and it was about Wittgenstein's period in Norway, as a guest and a foreigner in Norway, right? And then I was invited to do, I don't know the order exactly, but Frankfurt had the big birthday of Goethe, and they asked me if I would do a big work in the Schöne Kunsthalle in honor of Goethe. So I did it based on the Italian journey of Goethe, and so it was about the guest and foreigner of Goethe in Italy as a guest and a foreigner. The Irish Museum of Modern Art did a retrospective, and I had this massive hall. It's the museum, if you've not been there, is a replica of Les Invalides in Paris, and it was about Wittgenstein in Ireland, where he lived for some months, and Joyce out of Ireland. And so it was about the relationship between these 2 guys and there. And then in Tokyo, it had to do with this 300 years of solitude of the Japanese, and then the beginning of Westerner, because of the beginning of the trading with the Portuguese, it ended this 300 years. And they began to see Western influences in the art. And there was a famous, important collection there in Chiba of Japanese art, and the curator was not happy, but I managed to get into there and to use those works in my installation. In New Zealand, it was the relationship to the rival of the British. I don't know, a lot of countries. I did it all over the place. And I think like 16, different countries. But it's amazing. I mean, it's from once, it's like a continuing education, my work. I go into a situation, right now I'm doing a big commission back in Norway. I do primary research, I go back to the beginning, I learn all about that context, historically, culturally, and find the material from that context to do the works with. So it's, just keep going.
A few very last questions. We've spoken about many of your exhibitions. We can't speak about your unrealized exhibition because that's still to come. I wanted to kind of ask you maybe to tell us about any kind of other ideas of curating in relation to the digital age. Because one of the things is interesting that curating used to be a very obscure notion, only known in the art world. And when I told my parents in the early 90s when I did my kitchen show that I wanted to become, I was about to become a curator, they were very reassured because they were convinced it's a medical profession and that I had gone into the medical field. And they, Boltanski had told me one should never clear up misunderstandings, so we left the misunderstanding for several years. It was all a happy situation. And obviously now, if a kid would tell their parents becoming a curator, that wouldn't happen because it's all over the internet. And it's basically, and obviously this whole idea of the digital age where everybody's a curator and what that changes, and the notion of curating has maybe become also very blurry through that, yet at the same time, curatorial history is a toolbox for other fields. People who never would have read something on curating now read it. So I was wondering it's a kind of a big question, but how you see that idea of curating in the digital age. And I was wondering in general if the internet has changed the way you work, because the Wittgenstein show I saw was exactly the same month when Tim Berners-Lee invented the internet, which is kind of extraordinary, 89. And we live now in this digital age, and I wanted to ask you.
But it's funny though. I mean, what you said reminded me about your parents. My parents were not very happy. And once I stopped making what looked like art, they didn't know what I was doing with my life, and so I had lost contact. I hadn't talked to them for some time, and then my mother was in the grocery store line, and there was a Newsweek, and she picked up the Newsweek, and there was like 4 pages on me, and I was like 23 or something. And over the index, there was a little text by the publisher saying Kossuth would have been on the cover, and basically it was how foreign affairs was more important than art, because the Russians had moved in the tanks and kicked out Dubček. So I was supposed to be on the cover of the magazine, and then I got booted off because of the foreign affairs. But for me, it was, and I had a lot of attention like that. And it's kind of interesting. They didn't know what I was doing, but at that point, they figured that it must be worthy, And I don't know now how, I'm trying to think of the idea of my mother on the internet, and I can't do it, I'll be honest with you. In a magazine in the grocery store line was a far simpler, maybe more noble world, I don't know.
And has the internet changed? Because you mentioned research and that lifelong learning, which is fascinating. Each time you do a project, you learn, you research. Has the internet changed the way you
made
research?
the job so much. Well, also, I mean, when I do big installations, we have there's somebody in the audience who does it, works with me on it. We have a plan, photograph, but usually a plan, in which I can do precisely the installation. Like my show next month at Sprith Magers, I know what it is. It's already in the computer, and we know what will fit where. If we produce something, we know it'll work. It made it possible. I couldn't have done a lot of the works. For example, last thing. Okay, I have a farm in Tuscany. I'm sitting there, no lights, only a generator, right? We had this a phone came in, and I had this thing called a fax, just arrived in the world to have. And I had a guy, researcher, in the Brooklyn Museum, in the archive, in the basement, and I would send him, say, see if you can find this. And he would send these images on the fax of things that ended up, some of them, in the Play of the Unmentionable. And I basically did the curating in the summer on this fax with a candlelight, because I didn't have enough electricity for lights other than just to operate the fax, right? So the whole thing was done like that. And I had to be careful because it was thermal paper and sunny during the daytime, and so it all would go dark. So I had to work at a certain speed, early days,
Beautiful.
Yeah.
One very last question, and then we open it up for all your questions.
Before our hosts start bursting into tears.
Exactly. No, I promised it's not going to be a marathon. I made that promise, so we won't do a marathon. And I'd like one last question, Joseph, which is, Rainer Maria Rilke wrote this lovely book, which is The Advice to a Young Poet. And I see many young artists here in the room, so I was kind of wondering, and also many young curators, I was kind of wondering what would be in 2014 your advice to a young artist curator.
You want to do that as the last question?
To open it then up and ask you more questions.
Oh, are we asking? Okay.
Of course. It's only just begun.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying to the students I met with earlier this afternoon, a good professor, a good teacher, let's not get fancy, can tell you maybe at this moment in history, at this moment in the discourse, what the questions are. They can't tell you the answer. If they do that, they're a bad teacher. And that's kind of how I feel about that question. You know, I mean, we can maybe lead the way, show possibilities, but I think out of respect for everybody's own moment in history and subjective relationship with it, I just want to sit back and see what they do.
Joseph, thank you very, very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, and there could indeed not be a better transition to your questions than what you just said about questions. So, questions for
Or would
Joseph?
you rather go to dinner? Is somebody going to give them a mic? Yeah, good. Oh, there.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question with regard to the gallery space. For me,
regard to
the gallery space, like specifically just the white cube space that, you know, as in your photographs, you've shown work within. I wanted to ask, in 2014, like in art history, I feel that the gallery space has become so loaded that any work placed within it ceases to be active and becomes mere representation or display if it doesn't challenge the site in which it sits within. So I guess my question is, can art exist in any other way? Like we just spoke about the internet, and if not, is art not redundant?
Well, I think that our modernist tradition has defined art as essentially how. And it's about the limits of that medium, and it's essentially Kantian in that regard. And part of the problem is ways of delivery. The medium is we have a prejudice toward confusing that with the actual production of meaning itself. And the shift, for me anyway, in postmodernism has been from that kind of idea of art as about how to why, to the signifying process itself. Questions about, if you're an artist, why are you doing this? What does it mean, right? This is part of a political responsibility for the kind of consciousness we produce. And it doesn't mean you do art which is flat-footed in illustration and understandable up front. No, sometimes philosophy of science, there's a distinction between models which are illustrations and models which are tests. A lot of bad conceptual art is illustration, and I fought against it my whole career. But a test is more difficult, and the art market doesn't like artists testing. They want artists creating a brand. So, but a really creative. What I've always liked about the work of Bruce Nauman is that he continues to think, and his work changes, and that's what we should be doing. As young artists, that's how we started with our crayons, I was saying a few minutes ago. And this idea that I noticed at a certain moment, my heroes, the minimal artists who were the generation before me, that Carl had to put it on the floor, Don had to make a box, Flavin had to have a fluorescent light, that these were brands. It was like the shape of the Coca-Cola bottle. They had to have the work identifiable in the market, you know? And when I was a young artist, I mean, if you look at the work, I don't know, maybe it looks different to you now, but the work of the Freud works, all that variety, I was worried as a young artist that I didn't have a style, in a way, on some level, because my works were always different. I was thinking about different things, and they took a different. Now it all looks like the same thing almost, you know, art historically 40 years later. I don't know how that happened, but you know, it's I don't worry anymore. That's also true.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if that's an answer, but it's a response.
Are there more questions? I see a question here, and a question here.
This is something that I always wanted to ask to Joseph Kossuth, and now I have the opportunity to do it. And could you tell us the name of an artist that profoundly bores you?
Profoundly what?
you find boring?
Boring.
Oh my God, how much time we have left? No. I have different shades, different tastes of boredom about different kinds of art. And you know, part of the problem too much is the infusion of the corporate culture, the market race that is infused, is that it's like a horse race. And that's why I don't endorse. I mean, people know the younger artists that I find valuable work, which has a great potential. But basically, I don't like to endorse negatively or positively for the same reason, that I don't want this idea of the competition of the horse race. You know, when I was a young artist at Castelli, I never knew what other artists' work were selling for. I always thought it was none of my business. I mean, can you imagine that? How the world has changed. Go ahead, dinner. It's really okay.
There's a question here above.
I want to have dinner. That's the point. What?
One more question.
Yes, one more question.
Right. About the concept of there is nothing outside the text.
Take your microphone a little farther from your face.
Right.
Thank you.
Between Derrida and Picasso, what would be your feedback on the idea that there's nothing outside the text or outside the canvas? What do you think in your work that will be?
Yeah, I don't
do you agree
with either point of view.
You don't agree on them? No. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. So I have one very last question. It's
yeah,
actually
sure.
not a question.
Do we believe him anymore?
No. It's urgent, which is about. I think we should end on a joke. And I heard a rumor. Yeah, and I heard a rumor, Joseph, that you have. I mean, you've got obviously an extraordinary collection of your own work, collection of other artists' work, as we heard. You've also got an amazing collection of books, but you've also got, the rumor is a collection of joke. And there's a joke somehow about Einstein and Hamburg.
You know that joke?
Yeah, can you tell us?
Well, I always told that joke if I would be in a foreign country so I could understand language comprehension, because hearing a joke in a foreign language really is the biggest test of your proficiency in the language. Well, anyway, it's the story was I did a show at the museum in Hamburg, and there was a party for me, which I had to dance with the wife of Ludwig and of the mayor. And, you know, I thought this is not what I thought the job was going to be about. But anyway, but I went along with it. And at a certain moment, I'm hiding in the corner from being asked to dance with any other important person. And this guy walks in with hair looking a little like Einstein. And he walked over to me. He said, "Are you the artist, Joseph Kossuth?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, I heard that you collect jokes, and I thought you might like to have the favorite joke of my Uncle Albert, because indeed I am the nephew of Albert Einstein. And I said, "Wow, yeah, sure, this I would like to have." So it's a conversation between man and God. And man says to God, "Listen, God, for you, what are 100 million years?" And God said, "For me, it's only a minute." Man said, "Wow. Well, listen, God, for you, what's $100 million?" And God said, "For me, it's only a penny." So man said, "Well, listen, God, can I have that penny?" And God said, "Sure, just a minute."
Joseph, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes.
And can I just add